The most dangerous betrayals are never shouted. They're whispered just loudly enough for the wrong heart to hear. I used to believe nothing inside Adrian Moretti's world could truly surprise me. After 3 years beside the most feared businessman in New York, I had learned that power spoke softly, loyalty was priceless, and silence carried more weight than promises. I knew the rhythm of his mornings, the way he drank his coffee without sugar, the way he loosened his tie exactly 2 inches before walking into his private office, and the way everyone around him straightened their backs the second his footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. To everyone else, Adrian was impossible to read. To me, he was simply the man who always remembered to leave the porch light on whenever I worked late. That tiny gesture mattered more than the expensive gifts he occasionally brought home. It told me there was still kindness hiding beneath the reputation people feared. At least, that was what I believed until one rainy Thursday evening. The storm had rolled across Manhattan just before sunset, turning the enormous windows of our estate into mirrors streaked with silver rain. I had finished arranging fresh, white lilies in the dining room because Adrian always said the house felt calmer when they were there. The chef was preparing dinner downstairs. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Everything felt ordinary, safe. I carried a leather folder toward Adrian's office, intending to remind him that his charity foundation meeting had been moved to the following afternoon. His office door wasn't fully closed. That alone was unusual. Adrian valued privacy, especially during meetings with his closest advisor, Vincent. I raised my hand to knock, but Vincent spoke first. What if Claire makes the wrong decision? His voice was calm, professional. What if she disappoints you? I should have walked away.
I know that now.
Instead, I paused, waiting for Adrian to answer because I was curious. Curious people rarely like what they discover. Adrian didn't hesitate. If she ever failed me, I'd replace her. Time stopped. The rain outside disappeared. The music downstairs vanished. Even my own heartbeat seemed to forget how to move. I stared at the polished oak door, unable to breathe. Replace her. The words repeated inside my mind with terrifying clarity. Replace her. 3 years of laughter. 3 years of believing I mattered. 3 years of building a life that suddenly felt temporary. My fingers loosened around the leather folder before I realized what was happening. It slipped from my hands and landed softly against the hallway carpet, too quietly for anyone inside to notice. Neither man reacted. They kept talking, but their voices blurred into meaningless sounds. I never heard another sentence. My feet carried me backward before my thoughts could catch up. I walked down the hallway slowly, careful not to let my heels click against the hardwood floors. I didn't want Adrian to know I had been there. I didn't want him to see what those 7 words had done to me. By the time I reached the grand staircase, I had already forced a smile onto my face. Years of pretending everything was fine had made that easier than it should have been. When Adrian joined me for dinner 20 minutes later, he smiled exactly the way he always did. "Long day?" he asked, reaching for my hand across the table. I let him hold it. I even smiled back. "Just a little tired," I whispered. It wasn't a lie. In less than 1 minute, the future I had trusted had become something I no longer recognized, and somehow the man sitting across from me had absolutely no idea that I had heard every single word. The next morning began exactly the way every other morning had for the past 3 years, except nothing inside me was the same. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen through towering windows while fresh coffee filled the air with its familiar warmth. Adrian stood at the counter in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, reading financial reports as though the entire world rested comfortably in order. He looked up when I walked in and smiled with effortless ease. "Good morning." I returned the smile automatically. "Good morning." My voice sounded normal. That frightened me more than tears would have. I poured coffee into my favorite blue mug, but I no longer added the cinnamon he always remembered to leave beside the espresso machine because he knew I liked it. It was a tiny habit, almost invisible, yet it felt impossible now. Adrian noticed immediately. "No cinnamon today?" he asked. I shrugged lightly. I just wanted something different. He accepted the answer, without another question. That was the strange thing about trust. Once it existed, People rarely examine the small changes until they became impossible to ignore. Throughout the morning, the estate moved with its usual rhythm. Staff greeted me warmly. Gardeners trimmed hedges outside the terrace. Security vehicles rolled quietly through the long driveway. Everything continued exactly as it always had, while inside me every certainty had collapsed into silence. I found myself replaying his voice over and over. If she ever failed me, I would replace her. The words slipped into every ordinary moment like cracks spreading beneath polished marble. By noon, Adrian invited me to lunch at our favorite Italian cafe, overlooking Central Park. Normally, I would have accepted before he finished asking. This time I glanced down at my calendar, even though I already knew it was empty. I promised Emma I would help her choose decorations for the community fundraiser, I said softly. It was not entirely true. Emma had mentioned the fundraiser weeks ago, but she had never asked for my help today. Adrian looked mildly disappointed before nodding. Another time, then. Another time, I repeated. He kissed my forehead before leaving. The gesture felt exactly the same as it always had, yet somehow it reached a completely different person. That afternoon, Emma called, unexpectedly. She laughed while telling me about her 2 children arguing over whose turn it was to feed their golden retriever. Normally, I would have laughed with her. Instead, she stopped mid-sentence. Claire, are you all right? I stared through the library window at the rain beginning to gather once again over the distant skyline. Why would you ask that? Because you have answered every question with only 3 words. You never do that. I forced a brighter tone into my voice. I am just tired. She hesitated. You know you do not have to pretend with me. Pretending. The word lingered long after we ended the call. That evening, Adrian returned earlier than expected carrying a small paper bag from the bakery downtown. Lemon pastries. My favorite. He remembered every insignificant detail about me. That was what hurt the most. Someone who remembered my favorite dessert had also spoken about replacing me as though people could simply be exchanged like office furniture. He set the box on the kitchen island and smiled. I thought we could watch that old movie you love tonight. I looked at him across the quiet kitchen, searching his face for even the smallest sign that he realized something had changed between us. I found nothing except genuine warmth. That sounds nice, I answered gently. Then I looked away before he could notice that for the first time since I met Adrian Moretti, I no longer believed I understood the man standing in front of me. Silence has a strange way of growing. It does not arrive all at once. It settles into the empty spaces between ordinary moments until one day you realize it has become the loudest thing in the room. That was exactly what happened to us. I stopped waiting for Adrian by the front windows every evening when his car turned into the long driveway. For years, I had recognized the sound of his engine before anyone else did. I would meet him at the front door with an easy smile, ask how his meetings had gone, and steal a few quiet minutes before the rest of the world demanded his attention again. Now I remained wherever I happened to be. Sometimes the library, sometimes the garden, sometimes nowhere he could easily find me. The first few evenings, he simply came looking. There you are, he would say with a relieved smile, wrapping one arm gently around my shoulders. I thought you were outside. I smiled politely every time. I was just reading. It became my favorite answer because it required no explanation. Books never question silence. Adrian began working later than usual as another week passed. Important calls filled his evenings. Advisors came and went from his office carrying folders thick with contracts and financial reports. I used to bring coffee to everyone during those long meetings. I remembered how each person liked it. Vincent preferred black coffee. Marcus always added 2 packets of sugar. Adrian drank espresso so strong it almost smelled like dark chocolate. One Tuesday afternoon, I watched the housekeeper prepare the tray instead. She hesitated when she saw me standing nearby. Miss Bennett, I can leave this for you if you would like. I looked at the silver tray before shaking my head. No, you go ahead. She offered a small, uncertain smile before disappearing down the hallway. It should not have mattered. It was only coffee. Yet I noticed Adrian glancing toward the doorway when the housekeeper entered instead of me. His expression shifted for the briefest second before he thanked her politely. 'Tin Moment. Tiny disappointments. They accumulated quietly. Friday arrived with the annual charity gala hosted by Adrian's Foundation. Every year I helped organize seating arrangements, greeted guests, and made certain every volunteer felt appreciated. This year I stood in front of my closet for almost 10 minutes before closing the door without changing. When Adrian walked into our bedroom wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he paused in surprise. "You're not getting ready?" he asked. I kept folding sweaters that did not need folding. "I think you should go without me." "Claire, everyone expects you to be there. They will manage." He studied me carefully. Is something wrong? There it was. The question I had been waiting for. The question that could have changed everything if I had answered honestly. Instead, I smiled with practiced ease. "I have a headache. That is all." He stepped closer, resting the back of his hand gently against my forehead as though checking for a fever. The tenderness nearly shattered every wall I had spent days building around my heart. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "I will not stay long." After he left, the estate felt impossibly large. I wandered into the sunroom where dozens of photographs filled the shelves. Charity events, holidays, birthdays, ordinary afternoons that had once seemed too simple to remember. In every picture, Adrian was looking at me instead of the camera. I traced one frame with my fingertips, wondering how someone could look at me with that much warmth and still speak, as though I could one day be replaced. Outside, headlights disappeared beyond the front gates as the rain began falling once again. For the first time since hearing those words, I realized I was no longer afraid of losing Adrian. I was afraid that I had already lost the version of him I thought had loved me, without conditions. People always said Adrian Moretti could read a room within seconds. Investors feared negotiating against him because he noticed every hesitation. Politicians measured every word around him because he remembered everything. His advisors trusted his instincts so completely that most meetings ended exactly the way he predicted. Yet somehow the one person living beneath the same roof had become the only mystery he failed to solve. The first person to notice was Mrs. Harper, our housekeeper. She found me early Monday morning arranging fresh flowers alone in the garden instead of sitting with Adrian during breakfast like I always had. She watched quietly before asking, "Would you like me to move these inside for you?" I smiled without looking up. "No, thank you. I just needed some fresh air." She nodded, but I caught the worried expression she carried back into the house. Later that afternoon, I overheard her speaking softly with the chef in the kitchen. "She barely eats anymore," Mrs. Harper whispered. "Have you noticed?" "I thought they argued," the chef answered. "I have not heard them argue once," she replied. "That is exactly what worries me. They were right. We never argued. We simply drifted farther apart with every polite conversation." Even the security team noticed the change. For years, I had walked Adrian to the front entrance whenever he left for work. It had become such a routine that the drivers automatically waited until I stepped back inside before closing the doors. Now I watched from the upstairs window instead. One morning I saw the driver glance toward the front steps before looking at Adrian through the rearview mirror. Adrian followed his gaze toward the empty doorway for only a second before getting into the car. He never asked why I had stopped coming outside. He probably assumed I had simply been busy. That was what frightened me. Love should notice absence before anyone else does. A few evenings later, Vincent arrived carrying several folders for Adrian to review before an important meeting. As I passed through the hallway, he greeted me with his usual warm smile. "Claire, I almost forgot. Adrian asked if you were joining us for dinner after the meeting." Before I could answer, Adrian walked out of his office. "Only if she wants to," he said easily. I looked between them before shaking my head. "You both go ahead. I have other plans." I did not. Vincent hesitated for a fraction of a second, sensing something neither of us acknowledged aloud. "Maybe next time," he said gently before disappearing back inside the office. Adrian remained standing in the hallway after Vincent left. "You have had a lot of other plans lately," he observed with a small smile that seemed more confused than hurt. "I suppose I have. Is there something I should know?" The question lingered between us like rain clouds refusing to break. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to ask whether replacing people had always been so easy for him. I wanted to know if I had imagined every promise hidden inside the ordinary life we had built together. Instead, I adjusted the sleeve of my sweater and answered with the safest sentence I could find. Nothing you need to worry about. He accepted the answer with a quiet nod. All right. Then he kissed the top of my head before returning to work. I stood alone in the hallway listening to his office door close, realizing that everyone around us could feel the distance growing except the man whose heart I had once believed beat in perfect rhythm with mine. Adrian could detect deception across a conference table from 20 feet away, but he could not see the silent goodbye unfolding inside his own home. The morning I decided to leave felt almost disappointingly ordinary. The sky above Manhattan was clear for the first time in more than a week, and sunlight poured across the hardwood floors as though nothing in the world had changed. Adrian had already left for an early board meeting, kissing my forehead before walking out the front door exactly, as he always did. I stood in the foyer long after his car disappeared beyond the gates, listening to the silence that followed. It no longer felt temporary. It felt like an answer. I walked upstairs and opened the closet we had shared for years. I expected tears. Instead, I found only calm. It was the kind of calm that arrives after someone has spent too many nights arguing with reality. I reached for a single suitcase and placed it on the bed. I did not need much. A few sweaters, a pair of jeans, family photographs, my grandmother's worn Bible, the blue coffee mug I had carried from my first apartment because it had always reminded me that happiness did not have to be expensive. Everything else stayed exactly where it belonged. None of the jewelry Adrian had surprised me with. None of the designer handbags still resting in their boxes. None of the elegant dresses hanging neatly in the closet. They had never been the reason I stayed, so they could not become the reason I left. Mrs. Harper quietly appeared in the doorway just as I finished closing the suitcase. She looked from the luggage to my face, and her expression softened with heartbreaking understanding. "Are you going somewhere for a few days?" she asked gently, almost as though she already knew the answer. I managed a small smile. I think I need some time to remember who I was before I started measuring my worth through someone else's words. She stepped inside without speaking and wrapped her arms around me. Neither of us cried. Some goodbyes are too deep for tears. Before leaving the room, she pressed a small envelope into my hand. "If you ever need anything, call me." I thanked her, but we both understood that what I needed could never be delivered by a phone call. Downstairs, I paused in Adrian's study. The room still carried the familiar scent of cedarwood and fresh coffee. His desk remained perfectly organized, every file aligned with impossible precision. I took the silver fountain pen he had once given me and wrote only one page. I did not accuse him. I did not list every sleepless night or every smile I had forced across the dinner table. Some pain does not become clearer by adding more words. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the simple platinum ring he had slipped onto my finger 2 years earlier. The morning light caught the polished metal one last time before I turned away. My suitcase rolled quietly across the marble floor as I walked toward the front entrance. The security guards greeted me with their usual respectful smiles, assuming I was leaving for another charity meeting or weekend trip. I smiled back because correcting them would only make the moment heavier. As I reached the front steps, I stopped for one final look at the estate that had once felt like home. Every window reflected the bright blue sky. Every flower in the garden bloomed exactly where I had planted it. The house was beautiful. It simply no longer felt like it belonged to me. I slipped the front door key onto the entry table beside the letter and whispered the only goodbye I could manage. "You did not lose me today. You lost me the moment I believed I could become someone you would replace." Then I walked down the long stone path without looking back, leaving behind everything except the one thing I refused to surrender again, my own sense of worth. Adrian returned home just after 6 that evening, expecting another quiet dinner and another chance to convince himself that whatever distance had settled between us would disappear on its own. He loosened his tie as he stepped through the front door, greeting the staff with the same calm confidence he carried into every room. "Claire," he called naturally, waiting for my familiar reply. Only silence answered him. He smiled to himself, assuming I was somewhere in the garden or lost inside the library with another novel. He walked through the house at an unhurried pace, stopping briefly outside the sunroom before checking the terrace. Every room looked perfectly arranged. Every light glowed warmly against the approaching sunset, yet something felt different in a way he could not explain. Mrs. Harper appeared quietly from the dining room, her expression unusually solemn. Adrian noticed immediately. "Have you seen Claire?" he asked. She hesitated for just a moment before lowering her eyes. "Sir, I think you should go to your study." The smile disappeared from his face. Without another word, he crossed the hallway and pushed open the office door. Nothing looked out of place until his eyes landed on the center of his desk. A single envelope rested beside a platinum ring that reflected the fading light from the windows. He stopped walking. For several long seconds he simply stared, as though refusing to believe what he was seeing. Slowly, he picked up the envelope, recognizing my handwriting before he unfolded the letter with careful hands. His eyes moved across the page once. Then he read it again, slower this time. Every sentence settled heavier than the one before it. I had not accused him of cruelty. I had not begged him to understand. I had only written the truth. That I could not spend another day wondering whether my place in his life depended on never making a mistake. That love built on conditions no longer felt like love. That I hoped one day he would understand why I had to leave before I forgot my own worth. Adrian lowered the letter and looked at the empty ring beside it. For the first time in years, he looked completely lost. Vincent entered the office a few moments later carrying documents for the next morning's meeting. He stopped immediately after seeing Adrian standing motionless behind the desk. "Everything all right?" Adrian did not answer. He simply handed him the letter. Vincent read it in silence, then slowly looked up. "She left." Adrian nodded once. "When?" Mrs. Harper answered softly from the doorway. "This morning." Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though trying to replay every conversation from the past several weeks. The untouched pastries. The missed dinners. The empty seat at the charity gala. The mornings she stopped waiting by the front door. The quiet smiles that had replaced genuine laughter. Every small moment he had dismissed now returned with painful clarity. "Why did she not tell me?" He whispered more to himself than to anyone else. Mrs. Harper finally spoke the words no one else had dared to say. "Sir," she tried. Just not with words. The room fell silent again. Adrian looked around the office, noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The coffee mug she always left beside his reports was gone. The fresh lilies she arranged every Monday had not been replaced. Even the soft fragrance that always lingered whenever she entered the room had disappeared. The house had not changed. It had simply become empty in every place that truly mattered. Adrian carefully picked up the ring, closing his fingers around it as though afraid it might disappear too. Then, almost in a whisper, he asked the question that arrived far too late. "What did I miss?" Vincent remained silent for several moments, reading my letter one more time before carefully placing it back on Adrian's desk. He looked toward the rain beginning to gather outside the office windows, then turned back with an expression Adrian had rarely seen. It was not fear. It was regret. "Adrian," he said quietly, "there is something you need to remember." Adrian lifted his eyes without speaking. "The afternoon she is talking about, the conversation outside this office." Adrian frowned, searching through his memory. "What about it?" Vincent drew a slow breath. "You were never talking about Claire." The room became perfectly still. Adrian stared at him as though the words refused to make sense. "You asked me whether the new executive director of the foundation should remain in that position if she mishandled donor funds," Vincent continued. "I asked, what if Claire makes the wrong decision? Because her full name is Claire Donovan. She had just been hired to oversee the expansion project in Chicago." Adrian's expression changed instantly. He remembered the meeting. He remembered the financial reports spread across his desk. He remembered discussing personnel decisions before the quarterly board meeting. Then, he remembered something else. The office door had not been completely closed. His heartbeat quickened. "She heard only that sentence," he whispered. Vincent nodded slowly. She must have. Adrian leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, replaying every detail with painful clarity. If she ever failed me, I would replace her. 7 words spoken about an employee responsible for millions of dollars in charitable funding. 7 words that had somehow reached the one person they were never meant to describe. Every strange moment over the past few weeks suddenly fit together with devastating precision. The untouched pastries, the missing cinnamon beside her coffee, the quiet refusals, the empty seat at the gala, the polite smiles that had hidden a breaking heart. None of it had begun because Claire had stopped loving him. It had begun because she believed he already had. Adrian closed his eyes and covered his face with one hand. "Why did I not ask more questions?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you believed time would solve what honesty should have solved," Vincent answered gently. "You saw distance. She saw confirmation." Adrian looked down at the platinum ring still resting in his palm. It suddenly felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Mrs. Harper quietly stepped into the office holding a small vase filled with fresh, white lilies. "I almost forgot," she said softly. "These arrived yesterday. Claire ordered them every Monday for your office. Even this week, before she left." Adrian looked at the flowers without moving. She had continued caring for him while quietly preparing to walk away. That realization hurt more than the letter itself. He accepted the vase with careful hands and noticed a small florist's card tucked beneath the ribbon. It simply read, "I hope this room always reminds you that kindness matters." There was no signature. There did not need to be one. Adrian swallowed hard as the truth settled completely into his heart. Claire had never stopped loving him. She had only stopped believing she was safe inside his love. The silence that followed felt endless until Adrian finally slipped the ring into his jacket pocket, folded my letter with extraordinary care, and looked directly at Vincent. The confusion was gone from his face. In its place stood quiet determination. "Cancel every meeting on tomorrow's calendar," he said calmly. Vincent blinked in surprise. "Including the investors flying in from Boston?" Adrian nodded once. "Every meeting. Where are you going?" Adrian glanced toward the front door of the estate, the place where I had walked away believing I had been replaceable. "I am going to find the only person I should have never allowed to doubt her place in my life." The following morning the city looked exactly as it always had: busy sidewalks, endless traffic, impatient horns echoing between glass towers. But for Adrian, nothing felt familiar anymore. He left the estate without his usual convoy, without assistants carrying schedules, and without the endless procession of meetings that normally dictated every hour of his day. His phone rang repeatedly from executives, investors, and board members wondering why he had disappeared. One by one, he silenced every call. For the first time in years, the most important appointment on his calendar could not be written into a planner. It was simply finding me before regret became permanent. My trail was surprisingly difficult to follow because I had never intended to disappear forever. I had only wanted enough distance to hear my own thoughts again. Emma had quietly arranged for me to stay at her family's lake house in Connecticut, a modest cedar cabin overlooking calm water nearly 90 miles from Manhattan. There were no security gates,
No marble floors.
no private staff, just a wooden porch, a rocking chair, and mornings filled with birds instead of ringing telephones. I spent hours sitting beside the lake with a notebook resting on my knees, trying to remember the woman I had been before every decision revolved around someone else's world. Emma never pressured me to talk. Sometimes healing begins with the kindness of someone willing to sit beside your silence. Late that afternoon, a familiar black sedan slowly rolled onto the gravel driveway before stopping several yards from the porch. Adrian stepped out alone. No driver opened the door for him. No one followed behind. His suit jacket was folded neatly over one arm, and the polished confidence he usually carried seemed to have been replaced by something far more human: uncertainty. Through the window, I watched him stand beside the car for several long seconds, as though gathering enough courage to walk the remaining distance. It struck me that I had never seen him hesitate before. He finally approached the porch with slow, careful steps, stopping several feet away instead of coming closer. He looked at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The wind carried the scent of pine across the lake, while the wooden swing creaked softly behind me. "I know why you left," he said at last. His voice was calm, but I could hear the exhaustion beneath every word. I folded my hands together, waiting. "I also know why you believed what you heard." I searched his face without answering. "Vincent told me everything after I found your letter," he continued. "The conversation was about the executive director of the foundation. Her name is Claire Donovan. We were discussing a leadership position, not you." My heart wanted to believe him immediately. My mind refused to move that quickly. "You should have told me that weeks ago," I replied quietly. Adrian lowered his eyes. "I should have asked why the woman I love suddenly stopped smiling before I convinced myself everything would fix itself." The honesty in his voice hurt almost as much as the misunderstanding itself. He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed the platinum ring on the porch railing between us. He did not try to hand it to me. He did not ask me to wear it again. "I am not here to ask you to come home today," he said softly. "I am here because you deserved the truth the moment you heard those words, and I failed to give it to you." The late afternoon sunlight reflected across the quiet lake as neither of us moved. For the first time since I walked away, it no longer felt as though two people were trying to win an argument. It felt like two hearts finally standing in the same truth, uncertain about tomorrow but honest enough to stop hiding from yesterday. The sun had almost disappeared behind the trees when I finally stood and walked toward the porch railing where the platinum ring rested between us. Neither of us reached for it. Somehow that small distance felt more important than any words we could have spoken. I looked into Adrian's eyes and saw something I had never seen before. He was not trying to persuade me. He was not trying to win. He was simply hoping I would believe the truth. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked quietly. Adrian shook his head. It was not the sentence itself. It was how easily I believed it could be true. He lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Then that is my failure, not yours." The breeze carried ripples across the lake, while the last light of day reflected like scattered pieces of glass on the water. Adrian took one slow step closer, stopping well outside my reach. "I spent years protecting everything I owned," he said. "My company, my reputation, my employees. I built systems so nothing important could ever be lost. But I never realized that trust cannot be protected by systems. It only survives through honesty." His words settled into the silence between us. There was no dramatic promise, no perfect speech, only a man finally speaking without the confidence that had once hidden every vulnerable part of himself. I glanced at the ring once more before meeting his eyes again. "If I come back, I cannot spend the rest of my life wondering whether I have to earn my place every single day." Adrian answered without hesitation. "You never had to earn it." I gently shook my head. That is not what I believed. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth instead of arguing with it. "Then let me spend the rest of my life showing you that belief was wrong." We stood there for another long moment until he carefully picked up the ring, holding it in the palm of his hand instead of offering it to me. "I carried this here because it belongs to you," he said softly. "But I will only give it back if it becomes a symbol of peace instead of fear." I smiled for the first time in weeks. Small enough that someone else might have missed it, but Adrian saw it immediately. "You finally understand," I whispered. He smiled back with quiet relief. I finally started listening. I reached for his hand instead of the ring. Our fingers met gently, not as strangers beginning again, but as two people willing to rebuild what had almost disappeared. The ring remained, resting in his open palm. There would be another day for that. Healing deserved patience. Emma quietly stepped onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee before noticing us, standing together. She smiled without saying a word, placed the mugs on the small wooden table, and returned inside, leaving us alone with the evening sky. Adrian looked across the peaceful lake before speaking one final time. "Everyone inside my company can be replaced. Every title, every position, every contract. But there is one place in my life that has never belonged to anyone else." He looked directly into my eyes. "And it never will." I felt the weight I had carried for weeks slowly begin to disappear. Not because every wound had healed, but because the truth had finally reached the place where fear had been living. As the first stars appeared above the quiet water, I realized that love is not proven by never making mistakes. It is proven by having the courage to face them before silence writes a story that truth could have prevented, because in the end, the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones humble enough to rebuild together.